At any given second, the human body operates as an immensely complex mechanical and chemical system. To survive, it must maintain a constant, dynamic equilibrium. Outside the body, the environment is inherently volatile. Temperature drops rapidly, physical hazards appear, and energy resources fluctuate. Left unchecked, this external chaos would quickly destroy the internal baseline required for life. Look at this graph. When environmental pressure forces the system below a critical threshold, surviving the drop isn't about static armor. It requires active, continuous computation to catch the fall and sharply correct it back to a flat baseline. To understand how the body achieves this, we must look through the lens of systems engineering. Biological function relies on two inextricably linked principles: structural hierarchy and automated control mechanisms. By evaluating the body through the first principles of engineering, we can map exactly how physical components lock together to perform systemic functions. Survival, therefore, is an engineering problem. The body relies on exact physical hardware to execute precise, life-saving software loops. The first pillar is structural hierarchy. This is the rule that biological function is dictated by structural adaptations compounding at every increasing magnitude of scale. The body operates as a nested hierarchy. The architecture of microscopic cells strictly defines the mechanical limits of massive organs. The second pillar is homeostasis. This is the relatively stable internal state the body maintains despite the chaos happening outside. Maintaining homeostasis requires a continuous, energy-intensive cycle of physiological adjustments to keep internal variables within a specific range. Together, structural hierarchy provides the physical hardware components of the body, while homeostasis supplies the logical software necessary to operate them. This stack diagram maps the body's structural hierarchy from the bottom up. At the absolute lowest level, the chemical level, we start with atoms, the fundamental building blocks of matter. These individual atoms combine to form molecules. In turn, these molecules bond to form the four biologically vital macromolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. These dense macromolecular structures assemble into specialized organelles. The organelles act as the internal machinery of cells, the functional units of biological life. When groups of identical cells function together to perform specific mechanical or chemical tasks, they form a tissue. Here, a single cell multiplies into a vast sheet of epithelial tissue. Different types of tissues then combine to construct organs, which execute complex, multi-stage physiological roles. Finally, groups of specific organs coordinate to form an organ system, representing the highest functional level before the complete organism. The esophagus is just one physical component connecting the pharynx to the stomach within the larger digestive system. Because of this strictly nested structure, an organ system cannot perform its function if there's a failure at the microscopic, chemical, or cellular level. Let's isolate the esophagus to see how its specific physiological duty, transporting physical matter, demands exact structural architecture. The internal lining of the esophagus is composed of squamous epithelial cells. This arrangement creates a flat, layered structure that acts as a sacrificial friction barrier. It is physically adapted to protect the deep tissues of the organ from abrasion by passing food materials. Beneath that protective barrier lies a secondary layer, smooth muscle tissue. Look at these fibrous, smooth muscle cells. They are mechanically adapted to physically tighten and shorten in a synchronized wave. This localized contraction generates the exact propulsive force required to move material down toward the stomach. Every one of these highly specialized cellular abilities relies on internal organelles doing the microscopic chemical work, perfectly linking macroscopic propulsion back to cellular biology. Biological structure is never arbitrary. The microscopic geometry of a tissue dictates its macroscopic physiological destiny. With the body's physical architecture established, we can examine its data processing capabilities. The tissues and organs are governed by physiological control systems. The most common computational mechanism in the body is the negative feedback loop. The defining logic of negative feedback is direct opposition. It produces a physiological response that counteracts or reverses the initial environmental stimulus. Any biological feedback circuit requires three distinct nodes to function: a receptor, a control center, and an effector. The receptor acts as the system's sensor. It actively monitors the environment and detects specific variances or stimuli. This data is passed to the control center. Acting as the processor, it receives the receptor's input, evaluates it against the body's set baseline, and issues operational commands. Finally, the effector receives those commands. It is the mechanical unit that carries out the physical response. Without this tripartite closed-loop system continually running in the background, the body would succumb to even the slightest environmental shift. We can see this control theory in action by looking at thermoregulation. This block diagram maps a rigorous negative feedback circuit. The process begins with an external stimulus. The outside environment forces the internal body temperature to drop below its acceptable homeostatic range. This triggers the first node. Receptors located in the skin and the brain detect the critical temperature drop and immediately transmit afferent data. The brain's thermoregulatory center receives this data. It recognizes the severe deviation from the baseline and fires an efferent command signal. That command signal travels directly to the effectors, in this case, skeletal muscle cells. It forces those cells into rapid, repeated contractions, an action we know as shivering. The mechanical friction of that shivering generates rapid systemic heat. This new heat acts as the opposing force. It drives the body's internal temperature back up into the normal range. Crucially, this feedback loop is self-terminating. Once homeostasis is restored, the initial cold stimulus is neutralized, and the circuit gracefully shuts down to conserve energy. But these abstract nodes on a diagram are actually physical structures. They are composed of the exact specialized hierarchical tissues we examined earlier. The thermoregulatory control center requires highly specialized nervous tissue to process data, while the heat generator relies on the physical strength of specialized skeletal muscle tissue. This single homeostatic process forces multiple organ systems to interact. The integumentary system acts as the external sensor, the nervous system processes the logic, and the muscular system executes the mechanical response. True biological function is never isolated to a single part. It is the product of mass systemic cross-communication. Without the rigorous structural hierarchy of specialized cells and tissues, the control center signals would be useless. It would have no physical machinery to execute its homeostatic commands. We can contrast this primary system with its much rarer counterpart, positive feedback. In a positive feedback mechanism, the system's output intentionally amplifies and enhances the original stimulus, rather than opposing it. This occurs during specific physiological crises. Blood clotting, for example, requires a rapid, cascading biological response that continually builds until a wound is physically sealed. But while positive feedback handles these isolated emergencies, negative feedback remains the dominant, everyday operating system of the human body. The human body operates as an integrated engineering complex. Chemical structures scale into organs that run continuous automated computational loops, allowing a fragile organism to survive and thrive in a volatile universe. These abstract nodes are physical structures. The control center uses nervous tissue to process data, while the heat generator relies on skeletal muscle. This forces multiple systems to interact. The integumentary senses, the nervous processes, and the muscular executes. True biological function is never isolated to a single part. It is the product of mass systemic cross-communication. Without the rigorous structural hierarchy of specialized cells and tissues, the control center's signals would be useless. It would have no physical machinery to execute its homeostatic commands. We can contrast this primary system with its much rarer counterpart, positive feedback. In a positive feedback mechanism, the system's output intentionally amplifies and enhances the original stimulus, rather than opposing it. This occurs during specific physiological crises. Blood clotting, for example, requires a rapid, cascading biological response that continually builds until a wound is physically sealed. But while positive feedback handles these isolated emergencies, negative feedback remains the dominant, everyday operating system of the human body. The human body operates as an integrated engineering complex. Chemical structures scale into organs that run continuous, automated computational loops, allowing a fragile organism to survive and thrive in a volatile universe.